Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics to write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today's guest is Robin Bonn, author of the book Market of One: How Your Agency Can Rewrite the Rules and Create a Lasting Competitive Advantage. Robin, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I'm delighted to be here.
My pleasure to have you. So, Robin, let's start off with you telling us about your professional background, about how you got to where you're at right now.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Thank you. So, my business is Codefinery. We're a consulting and a coaching business. We specifically work with agencies of all shapes and sizes and ownership models. Generally, they call us when they want to figure out how to stand out in their marketplace, how they want to evolve their business model, and ultimately how to command a premium with the work that they do. So yeah, I've been doing this about 11 years. I had a long track record of working in agencies. Decided to branch out on my own when I figured I could probably make more change happen more quickly from the outside looking in, and that's happily how it's worked out.
I'm just curious, before we get into the book, how has AI changed your business?
Well, it's changed. It's changed everything about my client base. It's changed everything about the urgency of demand in the industry, and of course, it's changed the way we deliver work as well. So, we are, in many areas, AI being one of them. We're always very keen to practice what we preach. I think we should be a kind of walking billboard for the practices we advocate for. So as AI kind of drives a bus through the business model of most marketing agencies, whatever their discipline, it's obviously influencing the way we deliver our work as well. So we're, as much as we are using AI as a driver of efficiency in the company, it's helping us handle larger data sets and be able to cut through that much more quickly, surface insights that allow us to then build on as human experts. We're also trying not to limit what we do with AI just to driving efficiency in the business. So as the same argument that we're making to agencies right now, I wrote something for the 4As in the US a couple of days ago to this exact effect. The sort of transition to making AI about effectiveness, not just about efficiency, is really powerful. So yeah, there's a number of initiatives in our business about how to use AI to do things we couldn't do before, rather than just to do things we did do before, but do it quicker and cheaper. So one of the things we're looking at right now, just sort of a live feed into our priorities, is the way that we handle our podcast. So we've used AI for a long time in terms of the production process, but how can we create an asset around our content and the library of content we've got with these incredible global leaders, and perhaps create a product out of it, perhaps create some tiered access points to it, how to make it searchable. All these kind of things are in the mix for what we could do with that podcast asset to make it useful for our clients, useful for prospects, make it a sort of more widely effective driver of interest to the business. There's lots of things we can do with it. So we're figuring that out right now. And again, we don't have all the answers, but we're certainly curious about, as I say, making that transition from just efficiency to also effectiveness.
Yeah, I get. What do you see as the biggest upside for AI in your world?
Oh, there's a massive philosophical question there. So I think AI, as I said, is driving huge acceleration of change in the advertising industry. And I say acceleration because, AI was not the start of this. Generally speaking, agencies have been selling time since the mid-'80s. That transition has not been a particularly healthy one for the industry. So the sort of long-term commoditization of agencies has been going on for that longer period of time. What AI is doing is accelerating the point at which it becomes untenable to simply sell time. And I think I won't even call it a sort of silver lining, but the exciting thing about that, and it's genuinely transformational for the industry, is that it's forcing agencies to get better at monetizing their thinking, rather than giving away, thinking for free during a pitch process, or, limiting the value perception of the work to the number of hours it took to create it, which of course makes no sense. So yeah, I think we're going to enter into a golden age of valuing the input of agencies and a much stronger industry that advocates for itself much better in terms of driving growth for clients, as opposed to just doing creative work or, and being measured for it, as I say, by virtue of the amount of time spent. So it is a tough time. There's a lot of disruption. There's a lot of people losing their jobs, and I don't want to diminish that. But I think this is the tough moment, and we're going to emerge as a much stronger industry on the other side of it.
I talked to the managing partner, Boston Consulting Group in Vietnam, and he was saying that for McKinsey and themselves and others, the whole thing has changed. First of all, they don't need armies of people anymore because now the companies don't want to hire an army of people to do research like people right out of college who did all that grunt work. Now they go like, hey, all you have to do is put the words in and up comes all the research that used to take weeks or months to do can be done instantaneously. But even more importantly, for them, with this new technology that's out there, that they have to change their financial model. So no longer are they just charging for hours. They get a project, they tell you, here it is. Half the project's going to be us. So you're going to pay us instead of 500,000 for the project, you pay us 250. And the other 250 we earn is based on success. So if we hit success by however they're measuring, then we earn that other 250,000 or more. So they have some skin in the game. The client has some skin in the game. And I think
Yeah,
probably a lot of consulting is going to end up being that.
I agree, and I think there's quite a lot of the advertising industry in particular is very good at sort of beating itself up and having these existential crises, on a fairly regular basis, and inevitably the sort of talent composition is going to have to shift. But I remain an optimist about these things. You don't have to
I
look
can
very
tell
far
by
to
your
find.
description of what you think is going to happen is
Right.
that you're looking at what the upside could be.
Yeah, and as I say, I don't want to diminish the people that are, adversely affected about that, particularly at certain times of life where it's, difficult to regain your footing. If you're 50 and you've got an expensive lifestyle and you imagine that, your career will be safe through to retirement. So that's a hard place to be at a very, congested job market. But, I take the view that, let's look at accountants for, just as a case in point. We had accountants, one description of it using a abacus or a counting machine, and then it was computers, and then it was personal computers, and then it was, software like Xero and Sage, and now we have AI, which should render a lot of that legwork kind of redundant, but we still have plenty of accountants doing plenty of valuable work, and we are a service industry in advertising, and as many others are, and I think that ultimately it's about the expertise of the humans. Now, we can debate about the kind of the hockey stick growth in the intelligence of artificial intelligence, but the advertising industry as a whole at the moment is absolutely convinced that the sort of taste and judgment that people bring are unlikely ever to be replaced. And I don't see a precedent where it has been in other spaces. So as I say, I remain optimistic about it.
That's great. So let's jump into your book. Chapter one, Beyond the Oversupply Myth. You argue that agencies are not suffering from oversupply, but from under differentiation. What made you challenge one of the industry's most widely accepted beliefs?
Well, I mean, it felt obvious to me. I certainly remember a moment where back in my agency career, this was probably 15, 20 years ago, the I remember presenting to one of the trade organizations, and we went in and we had a slide, and it sort of showed the idea at the center as the sort of the hub, various spokes showing various marketing channels, and we thought it was all very clever. And our branding was yellow and black, and the slide looked great. And then we sort of sat down, and the next agency came in, and we watched them, and they basically had exactly the same slide, making exactly the same promises. So the reality is that it's not a sort of, it's not imposed upon you that every agency has to be the same. So I don't think oversupply is a problem, because it only is a challenge to the business if everybody looks the same. So it doesn't really matter how many competitors you have in a market, and famously there are tens of thousands of agencies in most developed markets. That's only a problem if the customers that matter to you can't tell you apart. The analogy I'll give you is also in the book. We use liquid death as a great example. The bottled water market is extremely congested, and it's literally the same product in every single bottle. But of course, Liquid Death came along and they created a $1.4 billion brand in no time at all, because they offer something meaningfully different. And in their case, they do it on a branded basis. And I wouldn't argue that agencies should go down that route, but it goes to show that it's not about what's in the bottle. It's about how you generate some meaningful differentiation around it. So yeah, if everybody looks the same, then it makes it even easier to stand out. So yeah, for that reason, there is not an oversupply issue. It's just a question of under differentiation.
What experiences convinced you, based on what we're talking about, that the oversupply myth is actually limiting agency growth?
Well, I mean, throughout my whole career, and I spent many years in agencies before launching Codefinery, so I've been doing this a while. Consistently see that the agencies that thrive are the ones that have real conviction, and it's that conviction which sort of fuels a big part of the growth that they have. They're really focused. They're really clear on the problem that they solve, and they spend their time where they win rather than trying to be all things to all people. And that's the oversupply myth in kind of writ large. If you think that you are interchangeable with every other agency and you behave like you are, you're effectively commoditizing yourself. So if you choose to step out of that and to be meaningfully different, and I don't just mean a bit of snazzy packaging and a tagline, I mean genuinely different and a clear focus of your business, then that is the driver of growth in any company, is focus.
I spoke to the CEO of one of the biggest companies in Vietnam, and she's the CEO of Viatel, one of the biggest companies here. And I talked to their head of recruiting. I said, "Are you hiring marketing people and different folks that are starting to become maybe not redundant, but they're not hiring as many?" And they said, "Yeah, we're not. We're only hiring people with experience and expertise in industry. We're not hiring marketing people out of college anymore to do things because AI can do these things. If you have expertise in an industry, then that's what we're interested in, is that expertise." And so I think that's really changing the game in a significant way. What's your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a short-termist position. I understand it in that we are at the center of this storm where everything is changing so fast. But I think certainly in the advertising industry, it's easy to point at stats and look at redundancies, but there's a lot of other bigger, broader factors at play there. There's a lot of consolidation in the industry, which isn't just about AI. There was potentially an overhiring that went on, a sort of overcorrection after COVID. More to the point, it's just not sustainable. So, it's just the sort of makeup of junior talent that's going to need to shift. Yes, you're not going to hire really bright graduates and attract them to do, grunt work and, research basic stuff off the internet and pin things to walls and all that stuff. Of course they're not. No one's going to want to do that or pay for that. But if the AI literacy of that, that emerging generation is strong, then they become very valuable members of the team. And obviously, if you don't hire them, you're not going to have any middle management in a few years. You're not going to have any CEOs in a few years after that. So this has to get resolved. I think it raises the bar for the work that graduates do, as opposed to just being pretty boring grunt work, as it has done in the past. So call it optimistic, call it pragmatic, but I think this issue gets overstated.
If an agency leader remembers only one lesson from chapter one, what should it be?
Yeah, good question. I would say the most important breakthrough is about really being brutally honest with yourself about how differentiated your agency really is. And think about, whether your clients or your ideal customers could really tell you apart beyond rhetoric or beyond what you think is your reputation. And also, consider the commercial impact of being even more differentiated. We have a couple of tools on our website which might be valuable to mention at this point. So for one, we have a diagnostic questionnaire which sort of applies the principles of deeper differentiation that we've learned from codifying this stuff with the best agencies in the world. So that diagnostic questionnaire sort of helps people understand where they are on that journey. But also there's another tool, the business case calculator, which is really designed to help people understand the commercial impact of being seen as tangibly different by your ideal client. So if I can plug it quickly, the diagnostic questionnaire is at codefinery.com/DQ. And then the business case calculator is at codefinery.com/BCC. So yeah, two good tools are hopefully that really land this point.
In chapter 2, The Big Grind, you describe agency life as the big grind. What are the biggest warning signs that an agency has entered this cycle?
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, agencies, life in agencies and getting to use your brain for a living and solve novel problems, it's supposed to be fun. So if it's not fun anymore, I would suggest you're probably in a version of what I call the big grind. So some of the symptoms of that might be, endless pitching, not winning your fair share, constant fee pressures, low margins, very reactive decision making, fatigue within the leadership team, misalignment, constantly tweaking your positioning or struggling to implement AI or new pricing models, poor conversion by value as well as by volume. Where do we start? I mean, blaming clients for your problems, blaming procurement, blaming the market, disengaged culture. I mean, this is kind of the water that agencies swim in and just call it, a cost of doing business. And I think, even in a challenging market, we can look at those frustrating, so-called realities and we can address them. And that's really why the book starts by sort of characterizing the big grind, because unless you see it, you're like a fish swimming in a bowl, you're not aware that the water's there. And I think you've got to, once you're aware of it, you can start to deal with it.
Why do so many talented agencies become trapped despite having great people and great work?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think beyond a very few exceptions at the very highest level in any agency market, like great work it's a hygiene, not a high point. I think most agencies have great examples of what they do. It's kind of table stakes. So any agency that sort of turns up and says, well, it's all about the work, that kind of sentiment generally makes agencies invisible because it's not all about the work for the vast majority. It's about the outcomes you can cause. So even if you're an American agency and you have a smash hit Super Bowl ad, that might, for one, advertising is a very visible discipline and a lot of marketing disciplines aren't so visible. But yeah, even if you have that hit on Super Bowl, then it might drive some inbound for you, but it doesn't necessarily create lasting differentiation or allow you to command a price premium. So there's a sort of short hit of visibility, as I say. So all but a very few, few agencies are really served by, simply doing great work because it's not enough.
Which habits do agency leaders unknowingly reinforce that keep the grind alive?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think a lot of agencies are very good at telling themselves, or kind of lying to themselves, really. No agency owner I've ever come across would want to admit to trying to be all things to all people, but so many of them effectively, default to doing that. So a lot of agency leaders, their habit is to kind of believe that casting a very wide net across the potential market is what drives demand, and actually it's the opposite. I think a big part of that is sort of selling services rather than selling a specific ownable solution to a discrete problem. And by the way, that problem it can be broad or it can be narrow. The biggest holding companies in the world solve a very broad problem for the world's largest advertisers. They provide a one-stop shop for them, and equally you could have a very narrow ownable solution like, I don't know, reinventing iconic brands that have got a bit tired. So I think you have to be for something, which means you have to be against something else, which means you can't be all things to all people. And I think that habit is something which a lot of agency leaders struggle to break.
In chapter 3, 6 reframes for modern leaders, which of the 6 reframes creates the biggest mindset shift for agency leaders? And can you tell the audience those 6 reframes?
Oh God, you want me to list off the reframes? It's been a long day. I'm not sure I can do that. But let me tell you the one that sticks in my mind off the back of your question. Um, there's a few in here, but the probably the one that is most valuable, I think, is that this idea of specializing is not a single discipline or a vertical sector. Only because it kind of builds on the previous point. If you don't specialize in something, then you don't really have a business strategy, in my opinion. And agencies consistently confuse their capabilities with the notion of specialisms. So you meet an agency that says, "Oh, our specialism is that we do media and we do creative," and that's not a specialism. They're just two capabilities. So I think recognizing that specialization is a sort of a strategic imperative. It's not a very limiting step. So that phrase, like, kind of, we're not for everyone, which I think is in the reframes part of the book as well. Once agencies genuinely believe that they're not for everyone, then almost every strategic decision in the agency becomes easier. So I think rethinking specialization and it being an essential thing rather than a limiting thing is really certainly one of the biggest reframes in the book.
I had a friend who's had two healthcare agencies, and that's all he focused on was healthcare, and both of them sold for a lot of money because of a specific expertise. I even ran a multimedia company and got out of everything but working with pharmaceutical and finance, and then
Yeah.
a large company that was going public bought us right away. But if we had stayed a generalist, it's not so valuable.
Well, I mean, I think there's a double-edged sword to what you've just described, because, of course, vertical specialism is a very valid way of developing deep expertise and commanding a premium, and ultimately, in this case, being, hopefully a very healthy exit. I think one of the issues that the industry has at large is that it believes the only way to specialize is to go down that single vertical route. And so it's not wrong to do it. Of course it's not, but it's not the only route. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. So you can specialize in solving any kind of problem, and that can be, grounded in a vertical, or it could not be. But I think to be limited to just thinking that the only route to specialization is that one traditional route, I think that's a very, very narrow view.
Why do you believe changing beliefs is just as important as changing business strategy?
Well, I mean, I think that it's almost hard to imagine how they couldn't be as important as each other. I think changing an agency is really about evolving the culture. One of the things I've learned, not just as a consultant but also as an executive coach, is clearly business change and personal change, they have to go hand in hand. So I think with agencies, there's a kind of an unusual issue. It's not unusual, particularly it's a service industry, but compared with other types of businesses, there's an awful lot of cultural inertia. There's a lot of kind of collective wisdom. There's quite a lot of, we've always done it like this. It's not like a manufacturing business, for example, where you have a production line, and if you wanted to change the business, you would just install a new production line, and people would have to sit in different places, operate different levers, et cetera, et cetera. But within an agency, you don't really have any of that. So that's why really providing a compelling vision for people, and having a very organized change management program, which helps people understand what they need to do differently, how they need to behave differently, think differently. There's an awful lot of scarcity mindsets in the agency business, which needs deprogramming. So I mean, that change management absolutely has to speak to culture, and constantly reinforce the strategic changes you're trying to make.
Can you share an example where a leader completely transformed their agency simply by seeing the business differently?
Well, I don't know about transforming the agency just by seeing the business differently, but I do think that certainly every agency I've worked for in my, during my full-time career as an agency person, and then obviously as a consultant for the last 11 years, every single transformation story starts with someone seeing the business differently. One of the kind of core principles that we advocate for is that, if you're going to evolve a company, and I don't think this is limited to agencies, you're going to need to come up with some kind of vision for people, some kind of ideal destination or future state. And if you don't believe that that's even possible, then you're not going to invest the time and energy to define that future state. And you're certainly not going to inspire people and bring them on the journey with you. So it's hard to see how a company can transform without a compelling vision of the future, in my view.
In chapter 4, your recipe for competitive advantage, why is creating a market of one more than simply writing a better positioning statement?
Well, I mean, I suppose without repeating myself too much, I think AI is clearly reinventing the world that we live in and agencies within it. I think understanding that your business model is changing, it's a prerequisite for survival. It's that's a business strategy question, not a packaging question. So it's really about strategy, not strapline, as we often say in co-definery. You've got to figure out what business you're in. You've got to figure out what that transition looks like, and then expressing yourself through a positioning statement, let's say, that becomes much easier. But if you haven't done the thinking first, you're really just trying to nail jelly to the wall, and it becomes very subjective, which is a kind of a carousel that agencies often find themselves on, going round and round, trying to refine and finesse something which doesn't really have any solid underpinning. So it demonstrably has to be better, kind of more important than simply just writing statements.
This is a different type of question, and maybe that doesn't deal so much with book, but it popped into my head because I've always been curious about this. Companies like Google and AI, it sells themselves for in the very beginning for a long time. They didn't spend any money on marketing to do it. People just word of mouthed it. How do you go about selling a company like Chat that they even need marketing when so many people? I mean, I think Chat had 1 million users after 1 month, the fastest growth of any business in history. What do you go and say to the CEO or the head of marketing about why they even need it? I mean, even though there is a head of marketing, he may not be doing much marketing.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you won't move very far through the advertising industry without finding very clear advocates for building brands and creating the kind of connection between an audience and a business that can create real longevity. So if you look at some of the most famous brands in the world, a lot of them are built on a pretty consistent brand platform, and people remember that, and it creates a connection. So obviously these, certainly in recent years, these businesses arrive and we compare their hockey stick growth, and we look at the amount of time it took Facebook to get to a bajillion users, and now we look at Chat or whatever the next thing will be, and imagine that perhaps they don't need to advertise. But I think that the sort of growth of their user base is only just one lens on success. You need to go and talk to these businesses and find out what their goals are, and look at the investment model and the payback timeframe, and figure out whether why building a brand could be a real valuable accelerator for them. Even if they're growing like wildfire in the first instance, then there's almost, there's going to be very likely a very strong argument to create a much more emotional connection rather than just, something which perhaps is driven more by hype, as well as the efficacy of the product.
Are they more likely to come to you like, okay, let's say they're growing 1,000% a month in the first couple years, but let's say in year 4 or 5, now they're only growing at 10% a month. Is that when they come to you and say, we need some new magic here? What do you suggest we do to get those growth rates back up? Because I got to imagine that's probably when they start to call you.
Well, again, I mean, remember, they're not calling me; they're calling the advertising agency. So
I
my
mean,
job is,
that's what I mean.
yeah,
Yeah,
sure. So,
using, yeah.
Each of those businesses will be different. It depends on the leadership parameters. It depends on what they care about, how what their sensibilities are. But yeah, I mean, often those markets will mature. There'll be a bunch of different competitors that emerge after that early, the kind of first mover. We're seeing it now, obviously, with Claude and ChatGPT, and there'll be others. It's often who blinks first. Obviously the question about bringing advertising into those platforms is another consideration. The journey towards IPO. I mean, there are so many factors here which are going to be bespoke to individual business and market. But I think smart agencies understand these dynamics probably and see them coming before those businesses do, especially if they're run by comparatively young, inexperienced tech entrepreneurs. I think the value of that agency expertise from having seen these cycles before, it makes them great advisors. And it's a strong argument for why those agencies should connect with those business leaders ahead of demand rather than waiting for the client to decide that it's time for advertising or whatever other marketing discipline they might be investing in.
So back to our chapter 4, your recipe for competitive advantage. How does your framework differ from traditional branding or positioning exercises?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't know. I can only speak to the the branding and positioning exercises I've seen. But the way our framework has been built is that it's been designed specifically for and has over 10 years of provenance of use with agencies. So it's designed with very deep understanding of how agencies think about strategy, where they don't think about strategy, the kind of terminology that gets used in our industry, how people get that terminology wrong, how the different component parts of the framework relate to one another. All of that stuff, all of that misunderstanding, all that loose use of language, it all gets in the way of decisive change within an agency business. So, and that gets in the way of how clients, the agency and their clients kind of communicate their needs to one another. So, one of the things I think the framework we use kind of cuts through is that kind of noise and gets the clarity very quickly, and then it does provide that strategic impetus for the agency.
What mistakes do agencies make when trying to build competitive advantage?
I'll try and give you a quick answer to that. I think they try and communicate uniqueness before they've actually created anything meaningfully unique to communicate. There's an old adage about advertising's worth doing when you've done something worth advertising. As we're back to your point about the AI platforms, but I think that's true here. Agencies are very good at trying to concoct some kind of distinctiveness from something that just isn't interesting or different. And I think that's a big mistake.
In chapter 5, principle 1, believe in better. Why does lasting agency transformation begin with belief rather than tactics?
I mean, I'm not sure why any kind of lasting transformation would begin with tactics, but I think kind of alluded to this before. I think that the leadership need to believe that better future is possible. Everyone is just so busy. There's no incentive to invest the time in change unless you've got a sense that change is going to be, change for good. So, yeah, it has to begin with belief, in my opinion.
How can leaders develop genuine confidence instead of simply projecting confidence?
Yeah, I don't think confidence comes from having all the answers. And I think a lot of people in agencies are kind of conditioned to believe they have to have all the answers. And I think that's a sort of fearful response. You'll be familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect. The smarter people are, the more aware of how little they know. I think that's probably at play here. So, confidence comes from probably being clear about what you're expert in and where you're not, and being able to know that when you tell the client you don't know, that is a thoughtful and considered response rather than a damaging response. So, I think if you're able to make clear strategic choices as an agency and consistently back them, that's where a kind of base level of conviction comes from. And I think that bolsters your confidence over time as well.
What separates agencies that truly believe in their future from those that merely hope for growth?
Everything. Hope, as obviously the cliche goes, is not a strategy. I would argue that hope is pretty lazy and almost irresponsible, especially given the kind of firefight that agencies are in right now. AI, as we've talked about, it's a case in point. It's such a transformational set of technologies. Hope is a very poor answer to the question of how do I adapt my business to a world that's increasingly driven by AI? How do I adapt my business model, my talent model, my operating model? Like, hope is not going to cut it, I'm afraid.
In chapter 6, principle to define your dream, why do many agencies struggle to define what success actually looks like?
Yeah, I think this is important. Agencies are often so busy responding to clients and being reactive, they've never actually stopped and slowed down to define the business that they're actually trying to build. It's very easy for them to define to goals that are really vague, like, we want to grow, or we want to be the leading agency at this or the best known agency at that. Or they default to very clear financial metrics, which at least can be measured, but they don't really inspire the wider business. So I think, unless you've really defined, a vision of the future that people want to get behind and work for, and put the time in and the energy and the blood, sweat, and tears. I don't mean it has to be super hard work, but often it will be to transition a business. But if it's going to be fun and you're going to bring people on the journey, then you're going to have to come up with a decent definition of what success really looks like. And as I say, if you're not committed to doing that, or you're too busy chasing around trying to, keep the lights on, or try and win the business of any brand that moves, then you're just going to be terminally distracted and worried about the granular day to day, as opposed to having any meaningful vision or strategy to get there.
I'm just curious about what what majors in the agency field should people major in now in college that are going to be compatible with AI?
Yeah, good question. I think I'm sure around the world, sort of educators will have all sorts of variation in terms of the different courses you can do. But I think, I suppose more broadly, one of the things, again, call me an inveterate optimist again, but with the amount of opportunity we have in the modern world to create things which are not true, just the fragmentation of news being a case in point, obviously deep fake technology being another. I like to think that young people are going to have to invest and develop and nurture their kind of critical faculties. I think I would like to believe that rather than AI making us all a bit dumber because we just do what it tells us is the easiest, simplest answer, we're actually going to have to get good very quickly at being able to think first and, use the platform to develop our thinking, and then use our thinking to also, refine the outputs. So I think that critical thinking is going to be crucial.
And that's what I tell my students. I said, right now you're in the most competitive time in history, and you're not only competing against people around the world, but you're competing against AI. And the only difference you have is what's in between your ears and being able to express yourself in front of large groups. Other
Yeah,
than
agreed.
that, if you can't do that, then the company doesn't need you and you're crushed.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the critical differentiator for any of these students. And I'm just wondering, what majors do you think they should choose in your space that will still have some value? Because, like, I don't see business analytics having a lot of value because now all somebody has to do is pour in the data and AI will sort it any way you want it. You don't need somebody to interpret the data anymore because you have access to it.
Yeah, I think I probably would have said a similar thing. I mean, certainly with all of these disciplines, a bit like the accountancy example I gave earlier on, the legwork part of these tasks is eroding very, very fast. And the ability to, people's appetite for doing that work, the ability to monetize that work are obviously rapidly diminishing. But I don't think that excludes the opportunity for, analysis of data. I don't think it ever was a sort of purely functional job. And I'm sure, the sort of human overlay of what the tools can do. It's the same principle of having a column in Excel being summed at the bottom or averaged at the bottom of 1,500 rows. I don't want to add all those up and divide them up on a piece of paper, but I still have to figure out what numbers should be averaged and what to do with that average and what kind of average. So just I don't know. It will depend on the student, the market, the aspiration, etc. But I like to think that again, we're sort of moving towards an opportunity for people's creativity, their judgment, their curiosity. These are going to be the differentiators from one person entering the job market from another. And the tools, I believe, will only emphasize those human qualities.
Yeah, I feel from working at universities, I'm a serial entrepreneur, but I've been teaching for a long time, that corporate America or corporate world has to partner and find out what exactly should we be training these people for, and what theory should we just not be wasting the students' time telling them theories that you're never going to discuss in the private sector anyway. So what
Mm,
should we be preparing them for going forward? So that's what I'm
yeah.
curious about.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, obviously, with your one foot in academia and one foot in the entrepreneurial world, it's you're right at the at the sort of the epicenter of that dynamic, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, like even when I'm teaching them entrepreneurship, I tell them forget about gross profits, a meaningless number to anybody. Don't bother with it. Just worry about the net after you've folded in all the expenses. The only time gross, I say, comes in somewhat handy is if you're trying to figure out where the materials you're buying from are better than somebody else's in terms of quality and price. But after that, there's no real value to it. Nobody's like, oh, wow, you got 80% gross margins. No, all matters is what falls to your bottom line at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's the
Um,
difference between
and
vanity and sanity, as the saying goes, isn't it?
yeah, so back to you, chapter 6. How detailed should an agency's vision be before it begins changing strategy?
Um, I don't think it needs to be dramatically complicated, but I do think it needs to be clear. So it needs to be clear enough to guide decision making, and also clear enough to be inspiring enough that people want to help create it and refine it. So I'm a big fan of things being directionally correct. That's as opposed to something being perfect before you do anything with it. So, if we're working with an agency, helping it figure out its vision, as an accelerant to then developing the strategies to get them there, um, you know, we move through that section quite quickly because as long as we're heading in the right direction, the refinements fall out quite easily as we move through it. And we were quite a co-creative business. That's the kind of iterative process that we follow. But it's like with most things. If it's not clear and simple, it's going to be pretty useless to anybody. If people can't understand it, it doesn't matter how clever it is.
Um, what surprised you the most about the relationship between clarity and motivation?
Surprised me. I I suppose I'm not sure surprised is the word, but I constantly enjoy seeing how engaged and energized people become when they understand not just what they're doing, but also where it's all heading. So I think that it's almost like a sense of purpose aligned with role clarity. So yeah, if you know what you're doing and why it matters to the wider organization, and you're bought into what that organization is trying to achieve, then I think that can, even of itself, can be quite a transformational dynamic.
On chapter 7, principle 3, craft your narrative. Why is storytelling such a powerful competitive advantage in professional services? And we always tell our students that's one of the things we work on is the ability to be a good storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is because we're humans. There's a lot of neuroscientific evidence here about neurotransmitters and hormones and things that the way we experience things like trust and connection and belonging. I think a lot of that is demonstrably sort of generated through storytelling. It's the reason why we like going to the movies or reading books. We engage with the protagonist, we see ourselves in the story. And when that happens, we become more open, we become less critical, we feel more connection. Um, from an agency point of view or from a professional services point of view, that stuff doesn't happen when you show up and open up a laptop and say, here are our capabilities. That's not interesting and it's not engaging.
How can agencies avoid sounding like everyone else while still communicating credibility?
Um, how can agencies avoid sounding like everyone else while still communicating credibility? I mean, it depends how you define credibility. I think if you are leading with your capabilities, as many agencies still do, particularly if you call them specialisms when they are just simply services, um, I don't think it's particularly credible. It's dull. It's undifferentiated. You're making yourself quite hard to buy. I think leading with capabilities or services, it's like going into a restaurant and being handed a menu that's just got ingredients on it rather than meals. Now, I think, conversely, if you start leading with the distinct problem you're trying to solve for that client, the one that only you are uniquely equipped to solve, then that's much more interesting. That's me handing you a menu that's got meals on it that only I can cook. And that, I think, is where real credibility comes from. That's when the client leans in and says, tell me more, as opposed to, but what do you actually do that's different? You want those kind of, interest-based questions rather than clarification-based questions.
What makes a narrative memorable enough that clients immediately understand an agency's value?
Oh, because it's about them rather than about the agency. As I keep saying, if you describe an outcome that that client actually wants, and it's something that they need and they have some urgency around, without lapsing into just stating the obvious. There's a kind of sweet spot we talk about where a lot of agencies will, imagine there's a sort of spectrum here where at one end agencies just talk about themselves. We do this, we do that, we do the other, and it's all kind of capability or service led. If you go right to the other end of that spectrum, and you sort of oversimplify it to the degree that ultimately what they're saying is we're going to help you sell more things, which is so generic as to be, again, pretty uninteresting. It stands to reason that there's a kind of sweet spot in the middle of that where you've stopped talking about what you do, you've stopped talking about services, but you haven't been so reductive to just talk about what every agency ultimately does, which is help their clients sell things. Getting that balance right, finding that sweet spot is really critical. A lot of it comes down to the specific definition of the ideal customer. It's the level of presumed knowledge that buyer has. So yeah, in simple terms, you've got to make that narrative, that expression of business strategy, where you win, who you help, the problem you solve. If you define it in terms of what that client really cares about, then they'll remember it because they need it.
Chapter 8, Principle 4, Walk the Walk. Why do so many agencies fail to live the positioning they promote externally?
We've almost already answered this, Mark. I think it's because they treat positioning as a kind of marketing campaign rather than a leadership commitment. I think I said this earlier. You've got to think about this stuff as strategy, not packaging. So they don't live the positioning because it doesn't have any substance underneath it. It's just some cool stuff to say. And unsurprisingly, it's you can't live and breathe something that has no substance.
Hence, like all those sayings on company walls that nobody ever believes the company really means, right? Like you see all these quotes on walls as a way to inspire people, but if the company doesn't live up to the quotes, then it's kind of all meaningless.
Totally, totally. If I had a dollar for every single agency that had curiosity as one of its values, I'd be a very rich man. It is abstract qualities which are generically good things, but they are, for one, they're not really turned into behaviors and made real. But for two, they're, pretty universal. So yeah, I agree with you. It's like a motivational slogan on the wall, which, sort of sounds pithy, but, no one really knows what to do with it.
How can leaders ensure their culture consistently reinforces their market positioning? By the way, or do agencies do it and would it be smart for them to do it to bring in their clients to help them shape these things?
Yes, up to a point. This is something I cover in the book. So there's the whole kind of Henry Ford apocryphal story. If I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. We have to remember, I think, as agencies that yes, it's important to ask clients, to get their perspective so that they feel bought in, so that they feel included in the conversation. You can't just take what they say as read. And we see a lot of agencies falling foul of this in as much as they end up trying to position themselves around pretty generic qualities. If you ask a client what they like about their agency, they'll often say great thinking, really smart, creative, really strategic. They feel like they're part of the team. They are, they feel like they're in the trenches with me. Like all of these are at best, they're just sort of generic qualities that most agencies bring. And at worst, it's a kind of license for over-servicing. So I'd be wary of solely relying on the client's point of view. I think a more interesting argument is to look at where the client thinks the puck is heading in their industry. So if you can align your perspective and your service offering and the problem you solve with something that's emerging and compelling and difficult and worrying for the client, then then their input's going to be much more valuable.
What practical steps help agencies turn promises into everyday behaviors?
So I think this goes back to the organizational change we talked about before, but I guess it's about, like we said, like believing that something better is possible, setting that direction, and then really focusing hard as a leadership team to drive that belief through the business. I think I've talked about sort of developing role clarity for people, defining the behaviors, creating a real focus on accountability. Often within agencies, there's a real focus on doing the work and doing the work really well, as opposed to a focus on really moving the needle commercially for the client. It sounds like a relatively small distinction, but from a sort of behavioral point of view, it's enormous. So being able to bridge that gap, it really does require a clear vision and then really concerted effort to, as you say, convert that promise into people's ingrained behaviors and habits.
In Chapter 9, Principle 5, Reap the Rewards. Once an agency establishes its market of one, how does business development fundamentally change?
Yeah, I think new business, like once you're seen as meaningfully different, a lot of things change. And new business is a great example. It becomes less about trying to persuade every client that you're right for them. And it becomes more about attracting the kind of companies that really going to value you and your distinctive expertise. So effectively, in the way that you sell, you're able to really focus much more on fit rather than sort of hard selling. So it makes you much more able to establish trust from day one and have much more valuable conversations. You're sort of positioned as a trusted advisor, much more on a sort of peer-to-peer basis with clients. So I think, when you're able to show up with something which is meaningfully different and perceived as such by the people that matter, that are going to pay you, then, you sort of earn the right to ultimately, be seen differently. You end up selling differently. You end up being able to price much more progressively because, they see you as different. And that's really what establishes a relationship where you can, as we say in our industry, you can be a think for me agency or a do for me agency. Increasingly, as machines take over the doing work, then you want to be a think for me agency. So you have to show up with a point of view and recognize where fit exists and where it doesn't. And I think if you're in a market of one, you're making it abundantly clear what that market is and you're drawing people to it rather than saying, yeah, we'll do advertising for money or marketing for money. Let's go find everybody with money, which of course is the absence of a strategy.
What are the biggest internal obstacles leaders face when trying to reposition their agencies?
I think well, first of all, like the leaders themselves, I think the fear factor is huge. There's a sort of a worry that we've kind of alluded to already that, that focus is somehow reducing your opportunity to make money, whereas actually the opposite is usually true. Being strategically focused creates more opportunity than it would ever remove. So I think that's probably the biggest initial obstacle. Once that's resolved and there is, a real drive to create strategic focus, or as we call it, creating a market of one, then, it's the cultural inertia piece again. It's getting people on the bus with you, making sure you're clear about who is going to be with you on the onward journey and figuring out who the people that aren't going to be right for that journey, which wouldn't be right for them or for the business. And then being really consistent and focused around that change management program to win hearts and minds and to create clarity for people so that they're excited to come with you.
In Chapter 12, Entering the Promised Land, after completing the journey, what does success truly look like for agencies operating in its own market of one?
I think here success it's about once you become like the obvious choice for a really clearly defined group of clients instead of just one of many acceptable options. So it's what we're talking about is having a kind of clear and lasting competitive advantage. So not only to your earlier question, are you going to succeed more in business development and in selling, but also the kind of relationships you're going to generate with these clients are going to be more worthwhile. You're going to be more valued by them, which is going to be more satisfying and more fulfilling. You'll be paid fairly for the work you do because they need it, because you're not interchangeable. And I think you'll feel like you're making progress. You're not sort of stuck in this, difficult world we're in, which is so riddled with uncertainty and volatility. You effectively take charge of your own journey. And that's really what being in a market of one is all about. It's taking charge, defining where you win, and making not being defined by the things that are out of your control, and instead choosing to be the author of your own story.
So we're down to a couple closing questions here. What's one question you wish every agency CEO would ask themselves before their next strategic planning meeting, but almost nobody does?
Yeah, I mean, so many meetings in agencies are so granular and so operationally led. They're effectively status meetings. So I think even the fact that this fictional CEO you've asked me about is having a strategic planning meeting, that's a step forward. I think the question that I wish they would ask is probably about client centricity. Are we really optimizing our business so that our ideal client is relieved to know that we exist? Are we presenting our expertise and our qualities and our experience, our culture? Are we presenting that to the market in a way that's going to, really appeal to the kind of people that we want to buy from us? If they don't know who those clients are or how to appeal to them, then I think that's a big miss. So yeah, that's the question they should be asking. How do we become more client centric and make clients, really value the fact that we exist in amongst our natural competitive set?
Last question. When people finish reading Market of One, what action do you hope they will take within the first week that could completely change the future of their agency?
I think, these transitions, they start with one person. So it's about building a coalition very quickly. So one thing you could do would be to buy the book for the rest of your senior leadership team. Maybe a really easy thing to do would be to, I think I mentioned the diagnostic questionnaire at the top of the call. So get your whole SLT to do that diagnostic, codefinery.com/DQ. That is probably a very good outcome for someone that's read the book and wants to bring their team with them.
I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us from England. We certainly appreciate it. I loved how we were able to get through almost all the questions in 1 hour because, like any good agency guy, you're great at communicating everything you need to someone needs to hear in a very short, concise sentences.
Well, that's very kind of you, Mark. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, for me, a pleasure as well. Hopefully, you'll write another book, especially as the AI age starts to take off, and give us some of your thoughts about where you think things are going to go over the long haul.
Might just do that. Watch this space, Mark.
Everybody, thank you. Have a wonderful weekend. Take care.